what I am trying to get across here, at least ultimately, is that the thinking that lay behind first forays of the U.S. Navy into the Indian Ocean in the 1960s reflected a systemic interoceanic view of sea power. Sea Orbit certainly reflected such a conception. Sea Orbit was the brainchild of then Vice Admiral John McCain Jr. Seen here with someone else you might recognize, John McCain III, as a midshipman at Annapolis, father and son. This picture's taken in 1956. When John McCain Jr., Grandpa was also an admiral. He was one of Halsey's task group commanders in the Pacific War. Prominent naval family. Anyways, we're concerned with John McCain Jr. Then a captain, but on his way up. 1964, he was the Navy's Chief of Information, having previously been its Chief Legislative Affairs Officer on Capitol Hill, essentially the Navy's chief lobbyist. Later in 1964, John McCain Jr. became the commander of the Navy's amphibious forces in the Atlantic. In 1967, he was appointed commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe, based in London, responsibility at the time for the Persian Gulf. And in 1968, he became commander-in-chief of Pacific CINCPAC, based in Hawaii. A hard-drinking, cigar-chomping, highly decorated submariner. The Americans say submariner, the British say submariner. You don't want to make the error of calling one the other on either side of the Atlantic. McCain cut a figure straight out of central casting. This is a kind of mild state version. This is the version he's taken before. Cigar in hand, giving a briefing. This is him sink back. He was a captivating spokesman, whose vigorous advocacy and exposition of the Navy's global vision won him the sobriquet Mr. Sea Power. Through the 1960s, McCain honed and delivered many times over a speech on what he termed the Four-Ocean Challenge. Sort of big about that phrase. Emphasizing how and why the Navy was adding and needed to add the Arctic Ocean and the Indian Ocean to its established beats in the Atlantic and the Pacific. To be sure, McCain's script put forward a great deal of gee-whiz commentary and special pleading for various Navy programs, as I guess one expects in a speech designed for Rotary clubs, chambers of commerce, corporate conventions, congressional committees. Still, McCain's speech provided a remarkably cogent statement of the Navy's thinking about an increasingly globalized world. I guess it's as good here as anywhere to simply note, by way of definition, that in talking about globalism, globalization, I refer to Joseph Nye's definition of it, meaning that by globalism, I mean the condition of worldwide interdependence, I suppose the perception of that condition. By globalization, I mean the dynamic of worldwide interdependence. In other words, what Nye has described as the thickening of interdependence, or I suppose the thinning of it in instances of deglobalization. Of course, in McCain's day, in the 60s and 70s, one simply said interdependence. And it definitely was something that seemed to be thickening in the 60s and 70s. McCain drew particular attention to America's, quote, absolute dependence upon ocean shipping. At the time, the United States, he said, relied on imports for its supply of 40 out of 72 raw materials the Pentagon classified as strategic or critical. Without these, he said, you couldn't build a satellite, a submarine, or a bomber. Or worse still, he told audiences, we wouldn't have coffee, which he thought was, or insisted was, the most important of all the things they thought. Who cares about manganese and chromium and and cobalt. They didn't have coffee. To further complicate the situation, McCain pointed out, we are dependent on ships of other nations to carry 90% of our commerce. On any day, since 1960s, more than 9,000 merchant ships were steaming the sea lanes of the world. McCain insisted that these ships, quote, had to get through, or we as a nation do not survive. Around 3,000 of those ships were presumably in the North Atlantic at any one time, meaning that 2/3 were plying other waters, including the Indian Ocean. That Afro-Asian Ocean, as McCain described it, extended from New Guinea across the southern shores of Asia and around Africa. You know, I think that a real value, enduring value, of McCain's perspective here is that it conveys the idea that there's an Indo-Atlantic as well as an Indo-Pacific. The Indian Ocean links these things. We tend to think today the fashionable phrase is Indo-Pacific, relating the Asian Pacific of the Indian Ocean. But from McCain's perspective, the importance was also that the Indian Ocean was something, and you can see this is very much an Indo-Pacific. This is the CIA's own map of world sea lanes. You get the sense of the Indo-Pacific. And you can lose sight of the fact that actually the shipping also goes around here, and McCain said this was all interconnected. There's an Indo-Pacific, but there's also an Indo-Atlantic. Hence the phrase he used, Afro-Asian, to convey the idea that the South Atlantic was every bit as much a part of the system as, say, the South China Sea. Either way you look at the Indian Ocean, from the Atlantic, from the Pacific. It formed, McCain believed, the epicenter of decolonization and world population growth, as well as a source area for many of those strategic and critical raw materials. Manganese, cobalt, chromium, tantalum today that you use in your cell phones. As a result, McCain said the U.S. Navy would, quote, become increasingly involved in the Indian Ocean in the years ahead. That's 1963. In hindsight, such thinking can rightly be understood in the context of America's descent into Vietnam. In their own time, however, McCain's remarks might have seemed a bit of a reformulation of the Navy's stance in the post-war world. Back in 1954, a then young, rising political scientist named Samuel Huntington published an influential essay on national policy and the Transoceanic Navy in the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute, the Navy's quasi-official journal of opinion. Huntington argued that over the course of 2 world wars, the U.S. Navy had evolved from a continental navy of the 19th century designed for home and hemispheric defense into a force that exercised command over 2 oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. Consequently, in the years since 1945, the U.S. Navy had emerged as a transoceanic force, configured to maintain a forward presence on both the eastern and western peripheries of Eurasia, and to operate directly from those positions in wartime. It's very much a map of the world if you're sort of classically familiar. Mercator projection with North America in the middle, projecting out across either side. A 2-dimensional view of the world. Peripheral strategy, forward presence were certainly watchwords of the U.S. Navy in the 1950s. But the Navy's own mental map of the world was not so much this transoceanic chart as it was an interoceanic globe. At least that's how Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Naval Operations from 1956 to 61, and his staff perceived the importance of the Indian Ocean. Burke on the cover of Time magazine. This is a recent map, but I'm always trying to find something in 2 dimensions that convey some sort of sense of interdependence and interconnection. This is very much an updated version of that Richard Eads Harrison map. We see everything all linked together here. Burke had long perceived command of the Indian Ocean, the 3rd ocean as he called it, after the Atlantic and the Pacific, to be essential to the effective balancing of Eurasian power from the sea. Burke believed, as his chief of information, John McCain, had argued, that the U.S. Navy would increasingly be compelled to assume a variety of diplomatic, policing, and limited warfare roles in and around the Indian Ocean as Britain's hold in the region slipped in the 50s and 60s. Burke and his staff also speculated, though, about the Indian Ocean in the context of general and what the British called broken-backed warfare, meaning warfare after the apocalypse, after the exchange of nuclear weapons. Burke and his staff looked on the Indian Ocean as an indispensable maneuver space, those Navy catchphrases, in scenarios ranging from transiting strike forces round Eurasia from one flank to the other in the war against the Soviet Union, to a post-apocalyptic scramble for resources to rebuild a shattered world, an irradiated world. The Indian Ocean figured vitally and closely related in rapidly developing American interest in control of outer space. At the time, I'll give you some examples here. At the time, the Navy's new transit satellites, that was the name of these, which had been developed to navigate the Navy's new Polaris missile submarines, those satellites were put into polar orbits. In other words, these satellites, like photographic reconnaissance ones, CIA's initial Corona satellite, followed by the various incarnations of the Keyhole system, these satellites are all put in so-called polar orbits, meaning they orbit the Earth from pole to pole. This means that the Earth is essentially spinning under them, and on each pass, the satellite moves progressively westward. So that over the course of any number of hours, in general, they're saying it's about any given 24 hours, one of these satellites will pass over any given spot on the Earth. Now, what that meant, in practical terms, was for the transit satellites, these navigational satellites that would give a time ping that the submarines could pick up. They would know when somebody's overhead. They put an antenna up. They get their fix and then move on their way. These were going around the Earth, passing any given point once every 24 hours, which meant that you could actually command them from the continental United States. Once every 24 hours, you can upload new instructions. The satellite adjusts its course or whatever you need to do to the satellite. Still, you can understand the Navy's perspective. You can understand the CIA's perspective of monitoring their photographic satellites in similar orbits. You have such expensive things in orbit, it would be nice to keep track of them when they're on the dark side of the Earth. So I mean by a globe, the Earth is a ball. Half of it can't be seen from the other half at any given time. That means you want some sort of tracking facilities. Even if they're not so elaborate that you can actually issue commands and adjust the courses, you at least want to watch your satellites when they're out of sight on the other side of the world. In addition to these satellites in polar orbits, in contrast to them, there were a number of satellites on the drawing boards for use in communications, for use in missile launch early warning. One real worry in the 60s was that the Soviets were developing a missile system that would allow them to put warheads fully into orbit, which means that instead of launching over the pole, you could evade early warning radars on the other side of the Earth by launching south over Antarctica, and the warheads come up over Mexico and fall into the United States without any warning. So we did park satellites, the Vela Hotel system, they're all around the world. We have one over the Indian Ocean to detect those launches. They have to be tracked from the Indian Ocean. The satellite's in geosynchronous orbit, meaning somewhere over the equator. It's moving at the same speed the Earth is. It's actually moving around the Earth, but it's moving at the exact same speed as the Earth is rotating. So the perception is that the satellite is fixed in the sky. You have to maintain a constant line of sight. Well, you can't control a satellite in geosynchronous orbit over the Indian Ocean from Colorado Springs. You can't control it from Hawaii. And you can't control it from the eastern seaboard. In the case of El Hotel, it was controlled from the Seychelles. In the case of communication satellites over the Indian Ocean, they were controlled from different positions in Australia. You need something in the Indian Ocean. This is my idea about this sense that the Earth is a globe not a flat chart, and that the Navy well understood this. In other words, the Navy, for the U.S. Navy, the idea of a global Cold War was a war in which Cold War in which things really were genuinely, literally global, as opposed to global to mean far-flung, diffuse regions of the world. Now, it's fashionable, I think, and to a significant degree correct, to talk about such technologies, communication satellites and so forth, navigation satellites, as, quote, shrinking the world, as creating, in Kinder's word, a closed geography, a closed system. Yet, physically speaking, the world remains a pretty big place. Here are a sequence of so-called orthographic projections of the Indian Ocean. The projection shows the Earth as a globe in 2 dimensions. I've deliberately got here 3 views of the Indian Ocean. This gives you a sense of how big the Indian Ocean is, which is the 3rd ocean. It's also smaller than the Pacific or the Atlantic, yet it's still pretty big. Look at it from 3 sort of gateways. Here's the Indian Ocean seen from Australia. An orthographic globe that's centered on the center of Australia. You can't see all the Indian Ocean. You can't see all the Indian Ocean centered on Iran. Can't even see it. Here's Australia, it's sort of on the edge down here. Here's the Indian Ocean, this idea of an Indo-Atlantic. From South Africa. Here's Australia way over here. You can barely see the entry point into the Pacific. Iran's fading away on the north. The Indian Ocean is a big place, however much technology seemed to be shrinking it. It occupies around 28 million square miles, which is a space approximately 7 times that of the United States, including Alaska. The oil trunk route, which the Australians refer to as the Iron Road, from the Strait of Hormuz to the Strait of Malacca, over here to here, is nearly 4,000 miles long. An oil tanker typically moves somewhere between 10 and 15 knots underway, fully loaded. That means it takes an oil tanker bound for, say, Shanghai, for Yokohama in Japan, 9 to 10 days just to get out of the Indian Ocean. It's close to 5,000 nautical miles from the Persian Gulf to either the Cape of Good Hope or to Perth in Western Australia. In other words, about 2 full weeks steaming time on the high seas. U.S. Navy warships can, if they're moving flat out, go at, say, 30 knots. But the U.S. Navy doesn't day-to-day operate at 30 knots. They don't have that kind of fuel budget. Kind of thing you do in wartime and then for a very short time. Large U.S. Navy vessels, at least ones that burn oil, move at about 10, 15 knots. There's a cruiser moving from, say, Dubai to Perth. Favorite way in and out of the Indian Ocean for the U.S. Navy. Better have your port calls in Perth than in Singapore. Avoid all kinds of incidents. It's a good 14-day trip. As today, it's roughly what it was in the 1960s. The Indian Ocean is a big place. Burke and his Indian Ocean planners had, I think, a very clear sense of that reality. And of the fact that within this expansive area, in the 1960s at least, the United States had no infrastructure of its own to support naval operations, to support 2-week transits across such a large expanse. McCain, speaking for the group, placed high hopes in the potential of nuclear propulsion as a way to maximize mobility and endurance of naval forces in such far-off seas. He designed Sea Orbit to drive home that point. 3 nuclear-powered ships, supposedly not in need of fuel. That may have been true. The ships didn't need to refuel, but the airplanes did. Crews needed food. Ships also needed to stay in contact, preferably voice contact, with higher authorities. back in the United States, whether it meant Washington, Honolulu. Large swaths of the Indian Ocean in the 1960s were described by the Navy, by Berg, as, quote, a quote, radio desert. In fact, at one point on its passage across the Indian Ocean, Task Force 1 was in a complete dead zone for over 12 hours, completely out of contact, no ability to be in touch with higher authorities. For all intents and purposes, lost, although the Navy sort of knew what track it was supposed to be on, but it was out of contact. That little tidbit had passed completely unmentioned in that glitzy story in National Geographic. If the U.S. Navy was to operate major forces, meaning carrier groups in the Indian Ocean, it needed, at a minimum, ground facilities to maintain reliable radio contact. Burke and his circle, among Burke and his circle, there was no question of seeking, let alone being able to find, willing host countries for bases large or small on the Indian Ocean littoral, except for maybe Australia. Their alternative returns us to Mahan's notion of naval consortium between Britain and the United States. As one contemporary observer put it, well, the British system and American resources are a Siamese twin power. The British system, William Reitzel explained, can no longer work effectively except in conjunction with American resources. And American policy cannot yet employ its resources effectively except in conjunction with the British system. A euphemism for the British Empire. The Yale professor, that's what Reitzel was, and a regular lecturer at the Naval War College, was actually describing the Mediterranean in the 1950s. But he might as well have been commenting on